Well, I'm processing the onions and the shallots today. These are the shallots. I hesitate to provide advice as to how to do this because what I found is a lot of different people having success with lots of different kind of techniques, really. I'll tell you what I do though. So I'm separating them into use now and keepers. The use now tend to have something wrong with them. Well, like a thick neck, a bruise, or significant damage to the skin like this. Or they're very small, or maybe they've split into two like this one here, and I had to take a lot of the outer skin off basically. And the keepers tend to have a nice small neck. I can take them down to an intact skin, fairly easily. It's a real pain taking them down to an intact skin, and it's not really worth it unless you think it's a keeper. So in that case, I'm kind of looking at this one, I'd have to take a lot of this skin off here to get it down to an intact skin. And once you've done that, you've removed quite a lot of the onion's protection. It's like 2 or 3 layers basically to try and get that down to something that's intact. And intact is important for me. I find that if I don't get it down to an intact skin, I tend to get mold growth on this in between this outer skin and the intact skin. And obviously that renders the onion useless pretty much. So I really, for keepers, ones that are going to last well into winter or through into spring, to be honest, then I will try and get it nice and intact, so there's no room for the sweating onion moisture to sort of get trapped between the 2 layers. Whereas this, for example, here, actually, which has turned out to be okay, any sweat on the surface, because obviously the onion stays alive, any sweat from the inside of the onion will just dissipate basically. So rather than get sort of trapped and allow for mold growth. So that's kind of the way that I'm doing the shallots, and that's kind of what I'm looking for something that I'm keeping. But you can see how long that took me, and it's really just not worth it for the use nows, because they're not likely to develop mold in a kind of short time scale, between now and the end of autumn probably. So there's just not a lot of point kind of fussing over them too much. If there's any really loose skin, then I will probably try and remove that, cut the roots off. But this one, the neck's too thick on it, is never going to seal. So even if I got it down to an intact skin, there's probably no point, because you'll probably end up with mold growth inside the onion because that neck's not sealed. So that's down. I'm not going to fuss now to try and get that bit of skin off, because of that thick neck. It's not worth it. And pretty much all of these shallots, every single one is split, so none of them kind of come out of the drying room with an intact skin. They all need a little bit of work. I like this work though. It's very meditative, and you're sort of concentrating. Maybe not concentrating, and kind of in the flow. It's a lovely feeling. So yeah, I'll show you some of the onions as I get to those, but basically that's the shallots. Now, where do I store them? And this is where, so there's 2 areas of contention. Some people just take onions exactly like this with a stem on them and braid them and just stick them somewhere in a shed or something like that, and they don't have any problems. And then other people have loads of problems no matter what they do. I've tried everything, yeah, pretty much everything, and I still have some problems. So it's down to really whether you can get the right balance between temperature, humidity and exposure to mold spores. And it's tricky, to get that balance exactly right. What I've found is that the best place I've got is my workshop, and it's fairly cool, but it doesn't get below freezing. Ideally, in onions and shallots, they're best kept maybe above about 4 degrees centigrade, something like that. That stops the onion sprouting in spring. Shallots, I think, are a little bit less susceptible to sprouting in spring, but anyway, that's the temperature that I try and keep it at, about 4 degrees, and pretty much it does that on its own because it's an insulated workshop. And I try and keep the humidity about 60, 65, something like that, which is way above what it would be, way below what it would be naturally in there. And I do that with a little dehumidifier. I've got a monitor on it, it costs about £20 a year to run that dehumidifier. It just keeps that room, makes it a great storage room for everything basically. So £20, it's easily worth it for me to safeguard my onions and shallots. So, and as I say, just make it nicer, like everything stores better at a reasonable humidity level. Otherwise it would be up in the 80s or 90s really. And it has the advantage that obviously running a little dehumidifier, and it's only a little one, it just generates a little bit of heat as well. So it tends to, keep the room frost free. Not always above 4, but roughly above 4. I don't have any temperature control. I just run the dehumidifier and that basically does the work. And I want to keep it below sort of 18, 20 degrees, something like that. Because otherwise you're going to get mold growth. So you want it sort of cool enough, but not too cold, and humid enough to suppress mold growth, but not too humid. And because too humid you get mold growth, too dry, and obviously you dry your onions out. So and it would be very difficult actually to keep the humidity any lower than that. So that is what I do, and we've split our store so that the potatoes are in a different room from the onions, because the potatoes like it much more humid. So we tend to keep the potatoes also frost free, but around 80% humidity, which is way too high for onions, but potatoes need it that little bit more humid. So yeah, that's what I do. Right, so I've done the shallots and now I'm on to the onions, and the onions are much better than the shallots. I've got a really nice selection of small to medium sized onions, so that's what I would call small, that's what I would call medium, and the vast majority of them aren't like that one split. The vast majority of them actually have an intact skin, so they're going to be really quick to process by comparison with the shallots. And yeah, so I thought I'd just talk now about the things we've tried and that have failed for us. So we have just tried storing them without an intact skin, and as I said, we had loads of problems with that. We had loads of problems with mould primarily, and then we tried braiding them like that, just braiding them, and that was the worst ever year. We did 50% of them braided, 50% of them unbraided, and the unbraided ones did great. The braided ones just did terrible. We just got terrible mould problems on those, and they were stored in exactly the same place. All of our storage, we used to just store them in a well ventilated shed, and yeah, we just had loads of mould. But my allotment neighbour, she stores hers in an unventilated garage. She covers them to stop them getting too cold, and she doesn't have any problems with mould, or few problems with mould. She probably has a few, but not, it doesn't cause her very many issues. And so they're stored at much higher humidity and colder, and they're fine. One of my YouTube viewers has great success storing them in a extremely well ventilated shed, basically, a shed with gaps in the walls, so really more like a garden shelter, so way colder than me and way more humid than me, but extremely well ventilated, and she doesn't have very many problems. So I think it comes down to finding that, where, and then other people, of course, some people store them in a house, in an unheated bedroom perhaps, and there it's going to be quite, probably quite temperature stable, and low humidity, and they have no problems. So yeah, just, lots of different options that aren't kind of optimum, but in terms of like the science of what the best conditions are, but then they work. So I think with onions, I think it's very much down to trying different permutations and combinations of heat and humidity and ventilation levels, and finding something that works. And so that's kind of what we've iterated to ourselves, is trying to control the temperature a little bit so that we keep our onions for a long time, and then it starts sprouting in spring, and then using a dehumidifier just to bring the humidity levels down a little bit, because we don't have a really well ventilated space, and we don't have a sort of unheated spare bedroom or something where we can store stuff. So yeah, I think just try and see, and to be honest, that's just a great metaphor for gardening in general. Like a lot of things that are considered kind of perceived wisdom often aren't that true, unfortunately. So yeah, give it a try. So when I'm going through these now, pretty much anything that's just got a slightly non-intact skin like that, just putting that in use now. Anything with an intact skin is just going in save for late winter and spring. Same sort of logic as the shallots. I've got about half of my onions here. Also something like that, where there's kind of marks on the skin like that. I just put that in use now. So this is really enjoyable, working through these, so much quicker. If the splitting's really extreme, then I will just take a little bit of it off, like that one. So yeah, and the other thing is that some people say, I only keep really well, and then on sort of closer discussion, you find that they run out of onions in November or something like that. And so like pretty much everybody's onions keep okay till November, no matter what you do. So it's also down to how long. And in my case, I want to keep my onions until spring, typically May, because by May we've got plentiful onions again. It might be just sort of big salad onions or small overwintered onions, but you know, they're perfectly acceptable. I'm still watching out for these necks. Anything that's kind of got a really thick neck is going in use now. Anything that's got a nice thin neck can go in store. And obviously I need to dry those necks out, so I'll either have these outside on a nice sort of breezy day, sunny breezy day, just to dry the neck, or I'll just use a fan in the workshop. And I actually do have a fan in the workshop on just for an hour or so a day, just to move the air around a little bit. I just think that helps the skins dry off if they have been sweating, and again that just reduces the risk of mould. So it's all about mould for me, unfortunately. Just look at that, that is such a beauty. That's, I think that's kind of almost like the ideal size for storing an onion. I do find that the bigger onions they just don't store anywhere near as well, although again, occasionally you hear of some people who manage to store big onions. So, you know, and definitely as a sort of consistent theme, we found that the smaller onions, so that, you know, these sort of size, these store the best, which is kind of incredible, but true. And then of course commercial growers and commercial storers of onions, they will store in environmentally controlled storage facilities where they can control the temperature and the humidity, and obviously that means they can store them for a very long time, but they also tend to use a fungicide, and obviously we don't want to use fungicides on our onions, so that's not an option for us. Anyway, if you want to see more videos and read more of my ramblings on storing onions and shallots and garlic and all that sort of thing, just take a look at my ebook. You'll find a link in the description down below, and scroll down to the section titled Individual Growing Guides, and then look at onions and shallots or garlic or whatever you want to look at. And I do have some videos showing my store as well that you can find there, and you know, they actually see the evidence, because I am very keen on showing the evidence, because you hear a lot of things on YouTube about what people do and how great it is, and then you watch a video of them showing you how great it is and it's like, okay, that's kind of not my definition of great. And so I like my viewers to be able to make up their own minds and compare their results with mine, because you know, I might be going on about how fantastic my onions store, and then somebody looks at them and thinks, well, mine are much better than that, or mine are much worse than that, or whatever. So yeah, I've definitely found that with quite a lot of even like famous gardeners, when they show what's going on in their stores and they show what they're eating, and I think, well, that just doesn't meet my quality bar for something that I would eat, you know. So yeah, evidence is absolutely key, I think. So my name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.